It's another hot, sunny day, an occurrence that's more common because of climate change. Even though extreme heat isn't as destructive as floods or storms, it's often far deadlier.
Hundreds of people that we see or have seen die in extreme heat events. And I think it's very much the fact that we cannot see who is being affected.
So, what happens when scorching weather sticks around for weeks and rolling blackouts are needed to cope with the electricity demand? Are you prepared for the impacts on the power grid and infrastructure?
Railways can actually, extreme heat can cause defects in the track, which can be dangerous and cause derailments. We can also experience in roads, you can get rutting and bleeding of tarmac.
Joanna Acom is a managing director at the Intact Centre on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo in Canada. She says there's one key component that we're neglecting as we address global warming.
Not many people are saying what they're doing about resilience, whether that be to extreme heat, flooding, or wildfire.
We'll also look at 3 methods to deal with sweltering temperatures, the best communication practices as the mercury rises, and why heat waves should be considered a social issue. Hello there, I'm Tristan Field-Jones, and welcome to another edition of SitRep. We're going to do things a little bit differently this episode. I am joined by my colleague, who will be acting as co-host for today, MJ Banias. Now, if you've watched our fantastic breakdown series, you know that he's the voice and the face behind that, which is kind of our sister series, if you will, here on the Samdesk channel. But MJ, first of all, I want you to just introduce yourself for people who may not be familiar with who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me on, Tristan. I'm MJ Banias, and I'm a journalist, and I'm working on The Breakdown, which is Samdesk's visual investigation series, where we take global events, security issues, crisis moments, and we break them down to see exactly what happened and what that means for the future of your safety and your security. My job here is to help viewers understand sort of the world around them and how to better adapt to a very chaotic and changing world. And I'm excited to be on the SitRep, I must say.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of overlap between both series for sure, because both of us talk a lot about, proactive versus reactive and looking at some threats that might be a little less obvious than some of the more well-known risks that we are facing. And MJ, this topic that you found and this guest that you found for us, very appropriate. We are in the middle of summer. It's warm in many places in the west, or in the northern hemisphere. So, tell us a little bit more about what we're going to chat about here and the guest who will be joining us.
Sure. So our guest today is Joanna Acom. She is the managing director of the Intact Centre out of the University of Waterloo. And her role and her job and the role of the Intact Centre is to look at crisis weather events, those weather events that scare us and keep us awake at night. And in most recently, her most recent project has been looking at extreme heat and the fact that urban centers, as well as really, let's be honest, the entire planet is warming quite quickly, and we're starting to feel the effects. Whether it's on infrastructure, whether it's on personal safety and security, as well as realistically health. People are dying as a result of extreme heat, and her role is to try and help us understand why this is happening and how to adapt to a changing environment. So anyone who works in the security field, anyone who works in crisis management, any related sort of industry, heat is going to be one of the future security and safety issues that are going to have to be dealt with. We're dealing with it. We're dealing with it right now. And at the end of the day, I want to help sort of our viewers and listeners understand that this is going to be a future security issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and without further ado, here is our conversation with Joanna.
We've kind of tended to concentrate on flooding and fire because these are events that are the most costly in terms of financial recovery and kind of the cost to society. But really the cost of extreme heat is we're paying in people's lives. So it really is a disaster or kind of extreme weather events that are expected to become more frequent and more common with climate change. And I think the summer events in 2021 in Canada particularly act as a wake up call.
It's interesting that you said that, because my sort of automatic first question was, or my first sort of impression of all this was, no one thinks about the infrastructure damage that heat can cause. I was literally at a baseball game yesterday playing with the kids on a play structure, and like the black tarmac stuff that they put down for padding was literally melting under my feet. Like my shoes were sinking into it. It was so hot. So when it comes to roads, when it comes to buildings, when it comes to really our cities, whatever, like how much damage can heat cause from an infrastructure and from like a cost perspective?
Yes. So in terms of infrastructure, we're often very worried about the power system because obviously we're increasingly reliant on electricity, including for anybody who's using active cooling measures such as heat pumps. So kind of the power grid is obviously it is also vulnerable to extreme heat because we're actually asking equipment to operate outside its design specification at a time when there's actually great demand for electricity. So that can actually lead to more vulnerability in the system. And then, as you mentioned, like things like railways can actually, extreme heat can cause defects in the track, which can be dangerous and cause derailments. We can also experience in roads, you can get rutting and bleeding of tarmac. So the heat itself can adversely affect infrastructure, in addition to the health impacts, which is what we tend to focus on, like the impacts on people.
And I can imagine as those, like, as infrastructure fails, that's going to lead to even more health impacts, right? I can
Yeah.
imagine what it would be like to suddenly have structural failure on roads, railways, even like tarmacs for aircraft, air conditioning systems in your home or your apartment. I mean, all that starts to go down. The health impacts are only going to increase sort of across the board, across a massive population.
Yeah, I think our key worry is the power grid. So, for example, in BC, we had 619 people die, but and that was not with a power outage. I think the problem is if we did get a power outage during an extreme heat wave, particularly in multi-unit residential buildings where people are relying on electricity to pump water to the upper floors, where the elevators would not be working and then any air conditioning that people have would not work. And then that could be really a recipe for a bigger disaster because people could potentially, like people living alone or the elderly or people on reduced mobility, would kind of effectively be trapped in their building. And I think that's, something that we've highlighted in our report. It's kind of, we need to help these vulnerable people and prepare in advance for that. And think about backup power generation at the moment as well, because heat is not classified as an emergency. So we actually have to have backup powers to get people out of buildings and to get firefighters into buildings. But we don't kind of have rules about having longer term backup power generation abilities. So if people are in a building that's overheating, then they kind of just have to get out, and that might not be possible.
Would you say it's fair to perhaps classify heat as a bit of a silent killer? Because unlike a lot of weather events, you can see a tornado, you can see a hurricane, you can see a snowstorm. But with heat, for most of us, we just go outside and then think, oh, it's really hot, I gotta find some shade or I gotta drink some water. But heat seems to be one of those things where once a heat wave or a heat dome has passed and we realize that hundreds, if not thousands of people have died, it comes across, at least to me, like it's one of those events that can kill as many people as other weather disasters, and yet we don't seem to notice it as much because it's more, I don't know, subtle, or again a bit of a silent killer.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. And actually, so floods and fires often, particularly with flooding, we don't see the same level of death. We see a lot of damage to property and buildings, but we actually often only maybe a handful of people actually die, which, one person is too many. So I don't want to sound too indelicate, but it's not the hundreds of people that we see or have seen die in extreme heat events. And I think it's very much the fact that we cannot see who is being affected by extreme heat, because these people are probably at home on their own and nobody, we just realized too late that there was a problem. So I think that's a key social challenge, actually. And some of the actions to combat extreme heat are very much on social behavior and emergency planning to make sure that we are supporting people that we know are going to be vulnerable to extreme heat in advance.
So let's talk about that, because you wrote, along with 65 other people, you wrote this amazing report called Irreversible Extreme Heat: Protecting Canadians and Communities from a Lethal Future. So let's talk about this report you wrote. I'm looking at it. It's on my screen right now. And you sort of presented sort of multiple actions that can be taken in sort of two different categories. So let's talk about sort of immediate things we can do if I was, for example, somebody who, was a manager of a massive office building, or I had a company or a corporation with dozens, hundreds of employees. I was responsible for their health and safety, whatever. I'm a politician who wants to take action on this. What are the short-term things we can do? And we'll go there first, and then like long-term we'll go next. But what are immediately, as an expert, what do you say, Joanna, step 1 through 5, let's do this?
Yeah, so I think we have identified 3 buckets of action, I guess. So so the first was the behavioral and emergency planning changes. The second is green infrastructure, and the third is gray infrastructure. So I think, an immediate action is really to understand who is vulnerable in your building and what your building's vulnerabilities are, because particularly in commercial buildings, they may have, fridges or freezers or something like that that's particularly sensitive to temperature. But equally, you may have people who have reduced mobility or kind of older people that are also vulnerable. So I think the first thing is to understand your vulnerabilities and plan with those people or with those facilities what you are going to do in an extreme heat event, because it might, some of those actions are actually planning in advance what you do during the event, and then you also need to think about what actions you can put in place ahead of the event to reduce the risk. So this would be more like, we want people to prepare for the summer by looking at how they can reduce heat entering the building, reduce heat being produced in the building, so that we can really control temperatures, including a lot of passive cooling actions. So not just relying on air conditioning, but also kind of making sure that we are controlling the way we produce and let heat into our buildings. Some of the kind of gray infrastructure actions for buildings are particularly looking at insulation and air tightness, also kind of the glazing of buildings. So making sure that you're choosing low heat gain windows, for example, that you're thinking about shading, ideally external shading of those windows, or else blinds or interior shading. Also in buildings, we can use thermal mats, which is basically things like concrete tiling that absorbs heat, and it can sometimes be slightly uncomfortable to our feet. So we don't like it in a bedroom, for example, but that can actually absorb heat. And then you need to ventilate your building at nighttime to cool those surfaces down again. And then, if we are going to use active cooling, then we need to make sure we're using it in an energy efficient way. So if people are looking at installing air conditioning, or they should really choose heat pumps. This is a more efficient way, and we can actually use that for heating as well. And actually maintaining those systems as well, because it's not sufficient to have them. If they don't work when you need them, then they're not going to reduce the risk. So those are some of the gray infrastructure solutions. But we are also very much encouraging, particularly building designers or people who are looking at planning, to use green infrastructure. So, we can use trees around buildings to shade lower floors. We can use vegetation, like in car parks, actually a huge surface that actually absorbs and gives out heat and contributes to the heat island. So we can use vegetation and trees in car parks as well. So not just the buildings themselves. We also can use vegetation on our buildings, such as green roofs or green facades, so that it basically, and that actually can help reduce energy costs as well by kind of reducing what you need for cooling and heating as well. So there's a lot of win-wins in many of these actions actually, and a lot of them are kind of energy efficient actions as well as helping to reduce extreme heat.
In preparing for this interview, I did a lot of reading about what's been going on in the States right now, in the southern United States. Thousands of cattle have just like died in the field from heat. I know in the British Columbia situation, there was something like 100,000 fish perished during the heat wave, or even more. I feel like there's this big call over especially as leading into this summer, that there's been a big call for having cities literally have sort of heat safety officials who's they kind of fall under like the weather safety official kind of kingdom of a city, where you have a person who deals with tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, whatever, and they send out emergency messaging, they send out warnings, reverse 911 calls, all of that. But we don't do it for heat, and there seems to be a big call to have someone do this for heat waves and heat dome events. Is this part of our future? Is this going to go away, or is sort of heat going to be just part of humanity's future moving forward?
No, I think we're going to see much more action on heat as a disaster. And actually, in Athens and Miami, there are already chief heat officers who are in charge of kind of heat warnings and alerting people. And there's also an international campaign to name heat waves in the same way that we name hurricanes. The Extreme Heat Resilient Alliance basically are campaigning on this and it's on the international front, because it helps as a kind of alerting message to the seriousness of the problem, we think, because we probably, in Canada in particular, we have been a heating minded community for so long, worrying about how we're going to heat our homes during cold periods, that we are not necessarily as worried about cooling. So that kind of naming heat waves and putting the emphasis on heat alerts, like BC's have a new heat alert system. Quebec also have a fairly sophisticated heat alert system. So I think we're going to see much more attention on that, and that can help alert people to the fact that they should be doing something to anticipate those events also.
So you talked about some areas that are particularly vulnerable when it comes to heating, and I can't help but think of that massive heat dome that engulfed, as we mentioned several times already, British Columbia and the Pacific Northwest. I mean, places like Seattle and many regions in Washington were getting like really, really high temperatures that you wouldn't even see on the prairies in the middle of summer. So are some regions, again, I think like the Pacific Northwest, or maybe like the coastal areas, or even in the mountains, are those regions maybe more at risk of feeling the effects of heat domes and heat waves because they aren't used to them and because it is so unexpected?
So basically, we looked at 3 indicators, including the number of days over 30 degrees, the maximum temperature being experienced in the year, and the length of heat waves. So basically, when you look at those indicators within Canada, you see 3 areas that are more exposed to extreme heat. So that would be the lower lying areas of BC, and then the southern prairies, and then around the Great Lakes and down St. Lawrence River Valley. And essentially, it's clustered against the southern edge of our country, which makes sense because it's further towards the equator and generally hotter. So that's what we would expect, probably. But I think the thing that you said about people being used to the heat is also a key consideration. So we actually get acclimatized to heat. So when we have heat waves or heat events that are actually early, so in May, for example, in Montreal, actually here, we did have a heat wave in May, a few days over 30 degrees. So those early heat waves can actually be more of a problem than if we have those later in the summer, because people are not acclimatized to the heat. So I think this acclimatization is very important to consider. And also the fact the impact of the urban heat island in cities means that cities in particular in those areas are even more exposed because our artificial surfaces actually absorb the heat and then re-emit the heat. So our cities can actually be 10 to 15 degrees hotter in terms of surface temperatures and 12 degrees hotter overnight because the heat doesn't, it gets given out by the way the surface is overnight. So we just don't have that cooling effect or the temperatures dropping, which can, a prolonged heat wave can often be the problem because people get no relief and it's just constant.
Um, we've been talking a lot about obviously sort of the rising heat, the problems it causes to human health. But then, in your report, you noted that there's obviously effects on the natural environment, which in turn leads to effects on the economy and sort of the prosperity of a nation, whether it's Canada, the United States, or we mentioned Athens, so Greece, any nation. What's the correlation between the decline of the natural environment, the decline of species as the heat goes up, and sort of the relation to the economic factors that a country relies on just to be a country?
Yeah, so I mean, there's obviously certain elements like fish or shellfish that are very sensitive to heat. Obviously, you mentioned livestock, and watering livestock was a challenge during those heat waves, and also heat. It can also be linked then to drought and wildfire. So we can see kind of a cascade in impacts that we did see in summer as well. So definitely animals and kind of that economic dependence on that can be an issue. I would say though, in terms of the impacts of nature and natural hazards on the natural world, so nature adapts. So basically, we'll see kind of species moving northwards, probably to reflect the rising temperatures. But the issue for us is that we don't necessarily adapt. So we kind of value the status quo and everything kind of carry on as normal, and we build in fixed places. And it can be that nature actually will adapt, but we are not as adaptable. So I think that's where a lot of my work is focused, is on helping us adapt how we're living to also work better with nature so that we reduce the risks of climate change.
Let's talk about the, I guess, practical, physical elements that you can either have in place or you can plan for when it comes to rolling blackouts. We mentioned how the extreme heat will wear on infrastructure, and power grids are an element of that. So if you're running a business or an organization or a community leader of some sort, and you hear about the possibility of rolling blackouts to prevent the whole grid from collapsing, essentially, what should you do? What are some items you should get, or some plans you should have in place to prepare for the possibility of rolling blackouts?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, backup power generation is a key fact of this. And I think we saw as well in the storm that we experienced in Ottawa, which was a windstorm. It's not a heat storm, but actually knocked out power for a lot of people. So there were a lot of, I was actually in Ottawa, and there were a lot of power generators being buried around in people's trucks at that point. So I think if you have vulnerable people with you as well, it's particularly important that you prepare what would happen during that situation. But maybe also thinking about where you would go, because even if you don't have air conditioning yourself, actually a lot of cities have now networks of cooling rooms. Even things like shopping malls are air conditioned, so there's often a network of community support that is available to you. So I think thinking about outside of your own building, like whether you can kind of seek shelter from the heat elsewhere. So that, yeah. So you maybe not everybody is going to go out and buy a backup power generator, because obviously, that's another impact on emissions and use of resources as well. So, but definitely where we have vulnerable people, like elderly people's homes, like thinking about backup power generation there is particularly important. Hospitals and healthcare facilities, for example.
It reminds me, and it's funny to kind of make this connection, but every organization, every company, every city has plans for, what if it's an extreme weather event like a hurricane or a tornado? Like, where do you shelter in place? Where do you take your employees if there's a warning or if there's a fire? Like, you have fire drills. You do all of it. You have lockdown procedures. You move people around your building or out of it based on various sort of emergency situations, and a lot of them are weather related. Nobody, I don't think, or at least sort of a lot of places don't have like heat preparedness emergency plans. Like, what do you do if we're going to have a heat wave? This is where we move to, this is what we do, this is how, whether you stay home or not. Like, is this, again, as the expert here, is this something that we ought to start preparing for?
Yeah, and I think it is definitely, and I think the people who have gone through this, like I live in Montreal, and actually Montreal have a fairly solid emergency heat response plan, because we had a heat wave in 2018 that actually killed 86 people. And so we often see that post-event, people are very sensitized to the fact that the seriousness of the problem, and it bolsters our action on preparedness. So, for example, in Montreal now, there is during a heat event, emergency services actually already know where vulnerable people are living, and they have an action plan to go and check on those people, that they're hydrated and that they're doing okay, so that we don't have a repeated occurrence. So I think that cities are definitely thinking more about heat, and not just in their emergency planning, but also in their climate adaptation plans, which are kind of those more long-term actions. So there is actually a lot of focus on managing our tree canopy to help reduce the urban heat island effect in their cities, and particularly targeting that kind of work to areas that are kind of been historically underserved. Because we actually find that in areas where people are generally on lower incomes or have lower quality housing, have less access to nature or kind of vegetated services. These are people who are probably very vulnerable to extreme heat events and may not have the resources to help themselves as well. So that's definitely a factor in climate adaptation planning in the cities where I've been involved in their plans.
Is that usually how it goes? I mean, there was a heat wave in Montreal, as you mentioned, in 2018, where people died. In 2021, BC experienced a horrible heat wave where like 600 people died. Was BC unprepared? And is that sort of what causes people to become prepared? Their city has this extreme heat wave, horrible tragedy occurs, then we get ready, or is this a reactive thing for a lot of people?
I think sadly it is in Canada, yes, that we have, we tend to focus a lot on climate adaptation and preparedness when we've experienced a problem, because, kind of putting the argument forward of kind of savings or saving lives into the future, but the government's always trying to prioritize funding. So the seriousness of it is not always clear in advance of an event. So we have struggled to get attention to adaptation. So I think, yeah, at the moment we are in a bit of a reactive cycle, I would say. Like, for example, in the media and kind of public concern is it kind of lasts for a few weeks after an event, and then we get sidetracked on something else, basically. So the challenge for me in my job is really to kind of, bring the importance, and as well as the practical actions and the kind of, I guess, the business case as well for doing something in advance, so that we do prepare and that we do put in place these actions before the next disaster. Which is always our goal. But it is a challenge. And I would say that there is, so Canada is in the development stages of a national adaptation strategy at present, which will be delivered just before the end of the year. So basically, we're looking to that to really include extreme heat, because that strategy should govern the practical action that we take over the next few years and into the long term, but it includes short-term action. So we're very much looking for a short-term action on extreme heat as part of that strategy.
I guess going to, or speaking to the point of, we kind of get distracted when we're not thinking of a tragedy. And again, you use Canada as an example, but there's places in Europe, there's places in Russia where, talking about extreme heat in December or January or February, not going to get a whole lot of attention when everybody's trying to keep themselves warm. So this really is, Joanna, something that needs to be considered, I guess, on a year-round basis, because these heat waves will inevitably come. Like, they will happen, and they will happen more frequently as climate change becomes an increasing issue. So, really, it's a matter of planning for summer in February.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, this is something we've been struggling with actually, because often when we are providing guidance, we're trying to provide it in advance of something happening. So, for example, this report that we released in April, actually it snowed literally the day before we released the report. And I was thinking, well, maybe we're not going to get that much attention. But I think we are seeing a switch in the media as well to actually covering the solutions to climate change and climate risk rather than just the disasters. Because sadly, in a way, the disasters are becoming slightly old news because we're reporting them again and again. It seems every year that we have, there's some major flood incident somewhere, and it's kind of repetitive. So we are seeing more attention to the solutions, and I was really happy to see that, in spite of releasing this report in April, like when we were still in cold temperatures, actually in a lot of the country, there was actually a lot of coverage of the report and the solutions. And now we are experiencing heat temperatures. People have that information already in hand, so are referring to it. But I'm not convinced necessarily that we've taken a lot of action in those few months, but at least, it's slightly more satisfying than just seeing kind of coverage of what the problem is rather than what we do about it.
What is your hope? I mean, if you could sort of have your wildest dream met in regards to the your paper and in regards to your project, what would you want to happen tomorrow if you could? Like, if you could snap your fingers and make it happen, what would you have occur? Obviously, you can't undo the climate change situation, but
I think what I would like to see is key leadership on climate adaptation from the federal government coming out with this national adaptation strategy. So not just words, but actually action. And I would actually like to see us really working better with nature in our cities and on our coasts and with our rivers, because actually nature is very important to the natural balance, whether we're talking about temperature, whether we're talking how we manage water. And it could be really, a kind of multiple win-win situation when we actually work well with nature. So I think, really a balance of action around, great infrastructure solutions, yes, but also how do we work with natural systems in a more effective way.
If you have a plan for extreme heat, if you're a company or a major organization, what are some effective ways that companies can communicate that to employees? And also, what are some effective ways that governments could communicate extreme heat warnings or advisories to other organizations or other corporations?
So in terms of the government communication, I think during COVID, we have seen clearly that we're very good at communicating with the public when we want to, because at the moment, I feel like we are waiting for the local governments or the government to come in and sort it out, whereas actually it should be a whole society approach. We also need people to be aware of the risks and also play a role in managing them. So I think that's one thing that I would like to see. In terms of companies, I think, there's also a parallel focus on sustainable finance at the moment and environmental, social governance, reporting, climate disclosures, etc. So I think I would like resilience to play a much higher role in that, because we see a lot of focus on climate mitigation and net zero goals, that kind of thing, but not many people are saying what they're doing about resilience, whether that be to extreme heat, flooding, or wildfire. So that it's kind of like the poor cousin to the climate mitigation side at the moment. So I think in terms of government company action, I think much more focus on resilience and possibly resilient finance as well, because I think something like 90% of climate finance goes to reducing greenhouse gases. So that's 10% to resilience.
Excellent. Joanna, really appreciate the conversation. If people want to get in touch with you, or if there's some reading material or if they want to take a look at the report that MJ was referencing, where are some places they can go?
So yeah, you can. Well, everyone is welcome to email me at the University of Waterloo. So my email address is just joanna.akem@uwaterloo.ca. On our website is all of our materials are available in both English and French, and they're all free. And we want as many people to be using them as possible. So that this includes the reports, which are kind of fairly comprehensive, but also kind of public facing, like action orientated stuff. So that's all available on our website at www.intactcenter.ca.
That's Joanna Akem, Managing Director at Intact Center on Climate Adaptation at the University of Waterloo here in Canada. MJ, thank you for being a co-host for this episode. Really appreciate your time.
It was a lot of fun, Tristan. Thanks very much for having me. I look forward to doing this again.
Absolutely, and we will be bringing MJ Banias on more frequently in future episodes of SitRep. I'm Tristan Field-Jones. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, you can email me at sitrep@samdesk.io or follow us on Twitter at samdeskofficial. Until next time, stay safe out there.